Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for today's discussion. We have experts from both sides of the border with us here today. My name is Robyn Gray. I'm from Sussex Strategy Group. We're a government relations and strategic communications firm with offices in Toronto and Ottawa. We work with clients from across the country on issues pertaining to all levels of government. I manage our environment practice as part of our energy and environment team. The title of today's event is Year in Review, Current Trends in Climate Change Regulation and Mitigation. So within that spirit, if we look back a full year ago within the context of climate change in Canada and in the US, Canada had just re-elected the Liberals back into power with a minority government in an election where I'd argue climate change and the need for a plan to address it did become a determining factor in the outcome. In the US, last November 4th, the Trump administration notified the international community that it was planning to officially withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord in a year's time, making it the only nation to abandon the agreement. Globally, nations were preparing for COP25 after a successful UN Climate Action Summit in New York, where we saw more nations and private entities commit to net zero targets. While I don't think we appreciated it then, it seems like a much simpler time than where we are now, 8 months after the COVID pandemic was declared, and the impacts of which are only increasing in both countries. The urgency and imperative, however, to address climate change has not changed, but it's just been made that much more layered. Some governments see their plans for economic recovery intertwined with addressing climate change, with resiliency becoming a recurring theme. We have seen this in the EU, with the European Green Deal being part of the pandemic recovery plan, as well as intentions from Canada and from the now president-elect in the US, which we will discuss shortly, because I cannot believe it's only been 8 days since the election took place. So with all of this going on, I'm sure we could have a 3-hour discussion. We won't, but so we are going to focus on some key issues around climate change regulation and its challenges and sovereignty and private governance. We will finish off the discussion with some Q&A. So you'll see with any Zoom call, you'll see the Q&A box at the bottom. So please put your questions in there and we'll get to them at the end of the session. We will try to add a bit of time if we find the discussions going on a bit longer. But if we don't get to your question, we'll ensure that we follow up with you just to make sure that everybody gets their questions answered. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists in no particular order. Jennifer King is a partner of Gowling WLG's Environmental Law Group with a national practice in environmental law and its intersections with Indigenous, constitutional, municipal, land use planning, and regulatory law. Jennifer is an active member of the firm's Canada North Indigenous Advocacy Municipal Law Groups. Jennifer provides strategic regulatory advice and representation on matters including environmental impact assessments, natural resource development, major infrastructure projects, and endangered species approvals, including in Canada's near and far north. She is a tenacious litigator who represents clients before all levels of Ontario courts and the Supreme Court of Canada, and regularly appears before tribunals, including the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal. She has a special expertise in constitutional division of powers, foremost in the areas of climate change, municipal law, and transportation. Liane Langstaff is an associate lawyer in Gowling WLG's Toronto office. She practices environmental law with a focus on environmental litigation, environmental assessments, and climate change. She assists her clients with complex issues at the intersection of business, law, and the environment, drawing on her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences, MBA, and Juris Doctor degrees. She is the co-author of A Guide to Canada's Impact Assessment Act and frequently lectures at schools of law and planning. She acts as climate governance expert with the Canadian Climate Law Initiative, presenting to corporate boards on the risks and opportunities presented by climate change. Brook Detterman is a principal in the Boston office of Beveridge and Diamond, where he co-chairs the firm's air quality and climate change practice. He has represented clients on nearly every form of climate change regulation in the US, including federal programs adopted under the Clean Air Act, state and regional cap and trade programs, carbon offset development, and private governance actions. Brook has also worked on a range of international climate governance matters, including those arising under the Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, and CORSIA. Finally, Christensen, as of counsel in the Seattle office of Beveridge and Diamond. He is a leading energy practitioner in the Pacific Northwest. With more than 30 years of experience, Eric has successfully represented clients in litigation and regulatory matters, ranging from the U.S. Supreme Court to proceedings before federal and state agencies. His expertise encompasses energy regulation and transactions for both renewable and traditional energy producers, environmental permitting, renewable energy credits, electricity markets, and greenhouse gas regulation. So welcome to our panelists. Thank you for joining us today. Very clearly expertise across the board, which is great. So I think, as I mentioned, we will be getting through a few different topics. If I can change my slide. But I think what we want to focus on at the beginning is the outcome of the election. And so as I mentioned, these are the topics that we will be covering, but big old number one, we're going to be looking at the US election. So turning to Brook and Eric, what happened and what does this mean for climate change policy?
Yeah, thanks, Robyn. And I should say it's a real pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists and to be invited back to the annual year in review hosted by Gowling WLG. So thank you for that. So what does a Biden presidency mean for climate change, right? I think quite a bit. President-elect Biden has named climate as one of his top 4 priorities, right alongside addressing COVID-19, economic recovery, and racial equity, which are, of course, big macro factors at work in the U.S. right now, and has announced that the U.S. will rejoin the Paris Agreement, and I would expect that to occur pretty quickly next year. And alongside rejoining Paris, I mean, it's potential that the U.S. will reset its national determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, potentially with deeper cuts than were initially proposed when the U.S. initially joined under President Obama, and then proceed with developing some pathways for achieving those targets. Now, what could a Biden administration do in a divided government in the U.S.? A few things. Carbon pricing may be less of a long shot than it first appears. Some groups, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, have actually supported a national price on carbon. So it's not a black and white issue across industry in the U.S. Nonetheless, a divided Congress will make that challenging. I think we'll see incremental action under existing programs and laws too, things the administration can do without really any congressional support. A number of former regulators and experts have proposed a list of things. Among these are adjustments to FERC pricing rules for renewable energy. You could task EPA's Office of Air and Administration to use the Clean Air Act to develop increasingly aggressive GHG targets for motor vehicles, for power plants, potentially for the oil and gas sector, including updating the methane standards for oil and gas drilling that have been undergoing rulemaking over the past couple of years. The Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention's also likely to tackle increased HFC regulation under the Kigali amendments to the Montreal Protocol and bring the U.S. more in line with that, and do a number of things, other things under the Clean Air Act that may not require any congressional action. The couple other things that the administration can do is place an increased climate change focus in federal permitting processes under the National Environmental Protection Act, federal leasing actions, for example, and drive more local policies and help states pursue those as well. Buildings and electrification, for example, developing carbon sinks through the U.S. Department of Agriculture programs that have been recently launched could get expanded there. We could see an expanded application of the 45Q tax code, which supports carbon sequestration. I'm sure we'll see some action on biofuels. So there are a number of things I think that that a Biden administration can tackle. We'll also see how the Democratic Party comes together or not on this, given that there's some friction within the party itself, and certainly a more aggressive and a less aggressive element there. So those are some high-level thoughts, and I'll hand it over to Eric to talk more specifically about Biden's climate and energy plan.
Thank you, Brook, and welcome everyone. I think it bears emphasis, as Brook said, that the Biden administration has identified climate as one of its 4 highest priorities. And they have developed, as part of their campaign, a very extensive plan for addressing climate change. I think if you read through all the 250 or 300 pages, there's a lot there, and I think it's pretty clear that they thought pretty carefully about what they can do without additional legislation, as well as what they would like to do in terms of legislation with the new Congress. I think there is some possibility for new legislation. There's, I think, bipartisan agreement on some of the things that are listed here, such as new energy research. I think there's a good chance for a new infrastructure investment program that would emphasize green investments of various kinds. That being said, I think that the economy-wide cap on emissions is probably not going to be enacted as legislation, probably just as an executive order. Similarly, the plan includes making the electricity sector entirely renewable by 2035. Again, I think that's very unlikely as a legislative package, but certainly possible in terms of an executive order. There's a lot of other things that are pretty interesting that have been proposed, and I think pretty imaginative in some cases. So, for example, U.S. Department of Agriculture is likely to get a carbon bank, the idea being that farmers can sink carbon into their land and get some kind of an economic credit for that. I think there's going to be, almost every agency will be involved in some way. And so, for example, the U.S. Department of Transportation will be emphasizing expanding the infrastructure for electric car charging, and the General Services Administration will be promoting conversion of the government vehicle fleets to electric vehicles as a means to stimulate the EV market. I think the last bullet point there bears some emphasis. There's a very heavy element of environmental justice in the Biden plan, and I think they'll be working, and they have a lot of flexibility within existing legislative authority to carry that out. So I think there'll be a specific office for that in EPA. There'll be a carbon cabinet advisory agency on carbon and climate change as well.
Great. No, thank you very much for that. And Jennifer, maybe just looking at it from the Canadian context, what do you think this means for us when we see we see the Biden presidency come in?
Well, I'm curious to hear what you have to say too, Robyn. I think that certainly it appears that the Canadian federal government sees this election as significant. After some of the American television networks announced that Biden had won, the infrastructure minister, Catherine McKenna, who we know as the former environment minister, tweeted, "It's been a long, long slog these past 4 years internationally on climate action, and it will make a big difference to have the US back in the Paris Agreement, joining Canada and like-minded countries pushing hard for ambitious climate action." So certainly Minister McKenna sees this as significant, and there's been a lot of discussion over the last 8 days about this issue. Certainly there's general consensus that the Biden presidency will strengthen climate action in Canada, and that generally there's expected to be more collaboration and cooperation. I think it's notable that the Biden-Harris campaign and now the transition team uses the same phrase as the Liberal government used in their throne speech in September, "build back together." And that's further to what you were saying earlier in your introduction, Robyn, just this idea about reducing GHG emissions and green investment in the recovery after the pandemic. certainly that's what that commentators are saying, that I've been reading about. And from the perspective, Liane and I are counsel to an intervener on the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act reference, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But certainly if the US does start enacting more carbon pricing, whether it's national or states, that could reduce the argument for carbon leakage, as in if Canada has robust carbon pricing, some of the arguments against it is there could be carbon leakage. We could have the movement of innovation or jobs into the States. But if the US also has carbon pricing, that will reduce that argument. And certainly the other argument we see is that perhaps Canada can't afford to be more aggressive in their climate action because they could become uncompetitive if they're getting too far ahead the US on climate policy. Again, the Biden presidency might reduce that argument and could push Canada to be more aggressive in their climate action. What do you think, Robyn?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, taking one step back, it's just it'll be such a change in tone. And I'm sure this applies to all issues across the board between the two countries. But it will be, like you said, I think one of the key criticism or statements that any opponents to the climate change action that the Trudeau government has taken has been to say, well, the US isn't doing this. We're a smaller country. Why are we doing this? That's gone, hopefully, now that that won't be an excuse that one can use anymore. So hopefully it does kind of push beyond those types of statements and really look to making this a less partisan issue, at least in Canada, when it comes to acting on climate change. And one thing, I think there's a lot of different elements that I've heard the Biden commit to, when it comes to methane emission reductions, looking more at, or, putting some more clear messaging around climate risk disclosure and how financial entities deal with that. I mean, those will have roll-on effects into Canada as well. And another aspect that I had heard was that Biden is looking to create a climate change office within the White House, and to have a climate change czar who will look at all of government policy through that climate lens. So, whether this will be something that Trudeau can then emulate, I think that, we'll see if this kind of opens the door for some of these more aggressive policies that perhaps Trudeau just hasn't been able to do because of the political reluctance to do so. So that was, I think, well, we're going to have to keep track of just how quickly all of these things move. But there's still so much to talk about. But in keeping with the recent election in context, I'll look to Eric and Jen to talk a bit more about climate change regulation in the Canada and US. As the slide will turn. There we go. Seems a bit aggressive today.
Thank you, Robyn.
Yeah. So I think just briefly that one of the first acts of the Biden administration will be to re-enter the Paris Agreement, and I think they intend to be front and center in the international arena addressing the climate crisis. And I think that we can leave it at that. Anything, Jen?
No, I think that I think we can launch right into the kind of federal aspect of it, because we don't often get to have conversations with colleagues in the U.S. And vice versa. And just to say briefly, obviously both Canada and the U.S. are federations in the states, and in Canada the provinces. And I will start off by saying that the federations are very different. So Canada has a parliamentary model that is quite distinct from the presidential system operating in the US, as I think all of us in Canada recognize by trying to follow what's going on in the US elections. So it's very different. Obviously, we have the monarchy still involved in Canada. And in Canada, our constitution was passed in 1867, and it specifically defined the powers of the provinces and gave residual power to the national government. So you would assume more of a centrist type federation. Whereas in the US, the residuary powers were reserved to the states or to the people, and the powers of the central government were defined and limited. And so we don't have the time to talk about this in detail. I will leave it to the scholars to compare as they do. But what is clear is that over time, over the last 100 years or more, our understanding of federalism and division of powers in both countries has evolved as our courts have interpreted it. And what I have read and what the scholars say is that we have become more or less centrist in Canada and more centrist in the US. And our courts continue to wrangle or consider wranglings over jurisdiction. Despite our differences in the way our federations work, both countries are facing currently jurisdictional issues over who, the states or the provinces or the national government, and in some cases, local governments, who has the authority over certain aspects of the environment, and in particular climate change. We're facing these things right now. So what it's clear is that the debate about the division of powers, despite these constitutions being quite old, a bit younger in Canada, but still pretty old to all of us, is that these wranglings over division of powers continue, particularly in the area of environmental law. And why is that? Why is it environmental law that we have continue to have these cases, leading Supreme Court cases in Canada dealing with the constitutional division of powers? Why are they in the area of environmental law? And that's because the environment is not a subject matter that was specifically assigned to one level of government or the other in our 1867 Constitution. Rather, the Supreme Court has recognized that the environment is an amorphous topic and it's all encompassing. So it lacks the kind of definition to categorize it under federal or provincial power. It's not listed in sections 91 or 92 of our Constitution. So jurisdiction over the environment is shared. So regulation of GHG emissions is no different, it appears, as I will discuss in a few minutes. And it continues. This is currently what's before the Supreme Court on figuring out who has jurisdiction over this. How do we regulate GHGs while still being respectful of the Canadian federalism? So, and as we know, the impacts of GHG emissions, I don't have to explain this really to anyone who I'm sure is on this call. The impacts of GHG emissions and climate change don't respect political borders. And we all saw that this year, and I'm sure Eric could tell us more about this, the immediate example of the forest fires in the Western United States this summer. Those US wildfires directly impacted air quality in Canada and posed a health risk to some of the most vulnerable citizens of British Columbia, while those same people were facing the threat of the pandemic. So, so the impacts of this are even beyond national, they're international, that's well known, but many of the sources of GHGs fall under both provincial and federal heads of power, but many fall under provincial. So Canada's 10 provinces hold legislative authority under the Constitution over electricity generation, natural resource extraction, forestry, local works, as well as property and civil rights, whereas the federal government has authority over marine shipping, railways, criminal law, trade and commerce, and the residual power of peace, order, and good government, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. So who has the jurisdiction over GHG emissions in Canada? Can everybody regulate it? Or is this something that's going to be limited to one level of government or the other? And will be, that's the Supreme Court has considered a reference on that matter and will hopefully be telling us soon. I think that's probably enough about the Canadian regulation, other than to say that this jurisdictional wrangling over which level of government can regulate it, probably it has some import beyond just climate change regulation, just this issue about the clash between the provincial and federal governments regarding climate change. What's the what's the national government's scope of power to impose minimum standard legislation on provinces? So it kind of goes beyond climate change, but you know, really what's the, as some of the provinces mentioned in the reference, which we'll be talking about, you know, is the federal government a babysitter of the provinces if they aren't keeping up? So Eric, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, so I'll just, from the US perspective, the general trend has been, in the absence of federal action, the states have stepped into the breach, and as we'll talk about in a few minutes, have adopted some pretty aggressive climate policies. I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Eric. So if we go to the next slide. Canada's significant piece of federal climate action, not the first, but that's really at issue right now, is its Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, or GGPPA. The GGPPA was enacted by the federal Liberal government in 2018 to implement something called the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which was a non-binding national climate strategy that named carbon pollution pricing as one of its 4 pillars. And this framework was signed in 2017 by 9 of the 10 provinces in Canada. Simply put, the GGPPA is a federal legislation that prices carbon pollution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and encourage innovation in clean technologies. It does so in 2 ways. First, it places a regulatory charge on carbon-based fuels. This charge is imposed on certain fuel producers, distributors, and importers, and will increase through to 2022. Second, it establishes a regulatory trading system for large industrial emitters known as the Output-Based Pricing System, or the OBPS. It includes limits on emissions, a credit to those who operate within their limit, and a charge on those who exceed it. The OBPS is independent of the fuel charge. But the GGPPA does not apply to all Canadian provinces. Instead, it serves as a backstop in provinces that have not adopted sufficiently stringent carbon pricing mechanisms. And it's the federal government that gets to decide whether or not the provinces have applied sufficiently stringent carbon pricing mechanisms. So the intention of the Act is that it permits provinces to enact laws to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through any legislative framework, provided that the federal government decides that the provincial laws satisfy the minimum national standards. So what have the Canadian provinces and municipalities been doing to take action against climate change? What's interesting is that leading up to the enactment of the GGPPA in 2018, a number of provinces had enacted carbon pricing, including Quebec, British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. But in 2018, Ontario's government changed, and Ontario canceled their cap and trade system. And when Premier Kenny took power in Alberta in 2019, he also scrapped the carbon pricing scheme in that province. But the map continues to change. So the map that you see here about the state of carbon pricing in Canada is not accurate anymore, because in Ontario, Canada announced in September, a few days before the hearing of the carbon pricing reference, that they had approved Ontario's standards, which Robyn will tell us about in a second. And so perhaps, Robyn, maybe you can jump in and tell us.
Sure. So it was timely in terms of the hearing that took place in front of the Supreme Court. It was 2 days, I think, before that started, that there was a very early morning announcement by the Ontario government and the federal government that the federal government will approve the EPS, emissions performance standard, as an alternative to the OBPS, which, you know, I think was a decision that many had been waiting for since the provincial government had submitted the EPS as a proposed alternative more than a year before. So it did, I think, took some people by surprise in terms of the timing, but it also, you know, led to questions as to, so what happens now? This is now Ontario's 3rd carbon pricing system in 3 or 4 years. So it is something that obviously took people by surprise, but also, okay, so what is the next step? And right now we don't know what that is. The transition timing has not been announced, and we could see the provincial program actually being in place as of January 1st, 2019. It could be January 1st, 2020, or beyond. We'll just have to see. But it is something that, at least from the emitter side, they need to know, because they need to know who to report to. So it will add another column onto this ever-changing map.
Yes. And so, and I'll now turn to Eric. I just wanted to also add that on top of all of that, local governments and Indigenous governments in Canada are also taking action. So I'm sure we're going to hear from Eric about what subnational groups in the US are doing, and I won't give you the long list, but our Indigenous governments and our municipal governments are all taking action as well. They're not waiting to see what the provinces and federal government are doing. They're acting as well. Eric?
Okay, so next slide, please. So in the US, the states have the police power that allows them to protect the health and safety of their citizens and environment. And so the constraints on that are primarily what the states can do in terms of how far they can go before they step on the rights of either the federal government or other states. Using that power, the states have enacted a wide variety of programs intended to address climate change. These are two categories here. On the left, you see the carbon pricing, cap and trade regimes that have been introduced into the US by US states. The one that we're particularly going to focus on is California's, which they have an agreement to trade carbon credits back and forth with Quebec. But there's also the RGGI program in the Northeast states. All these states have gotten together and developed a cap and trade program where they can trade emissions credits back and forth. On the right side, we see the 100% clean energy mandates. And so these are sort of the outgrowth of renewable portfolio standards that started cropping up about 20 years ago, which required a certain amount of electricity delivered in a particular state to be from renewable resources. And so, for example, in Washington, the law in 2006 was adopted that would require 20% renewables by 2020, or 15% by 2020, excuse me. Similar laws were adopted in 27 states and the District of Columbia, I believe. More recently, they've gotten considerably more aggressive. The states noted here adopted 100% clean energy mandates. This is kind of just happened in the last couple of years. Even since this map was developed in April, several other states have gotten on board, and we anticipate that a few others will also jump on the bandwagon here pretty soon. And these generally require the states to convert their electricity sectors to 100% renewables by sometime in mid-century. And some have adopted even economy-wide caps on carbon emissions with the aim of reducing to net zero by roughly mid-century. So next slide, please. Oh, this is your slide, Jen, sorry.
So should I jump in here? I'll make this brief because I think there's been a lot of talk in Canada about these challenges. The Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta governments all challenge the constitutionality of the act that I just discussed, the GGPPA. The Alberta, Ontario and Saskatchewan courts of appeal, the majorities found that the act was constitutional or is constitutional. Alberta came out with a decision a bit later and found that it was not constitutional. All of these were split decisions, and all of them were focused on this residual power, the national concern under the Peace, Order, and Good Government branch, or under the Peace, Order, and Good Government under Section 91. So all three decisions were appealed to the Supreme Court and were heard in September at the Supreme Court of Canada. It was the first post-COVID hearing, I believe, at the Supreme Court, at least in person. And Liane and I, as I mentioned, act for one of the interveners. The Supreme Court heard from multiple provinces, dozens of interveners, but the focus again was on this national concern branch. And so the tension is really clear in Canada's submission versus the provinces that opposed it. Canada said that to deny Parliament jurisdiction to address this matter would leave a gaping hole in the Constitution. We would be a country incapable of enforcing the measures necessary to address this existential threat. On the other hand, you have Ontario's factum, which said that conferring Parliament jurisdiction over greenhouse gas emissions would radically alter the balance of the Canadian Federation. So this shows really how kind of live these issues were. There's many other arguments. One of the interesting ones that I'd like to mention is just the emergency branch of POG. Since over the course of arguing these references, more and more jurisdictions have been declaring climate emergencies. But really the focus was argument on the national concern. So every Canadian jurisdiction that participated in this acknowledged the existential threat of climate change, and no one disputed that it needs to be regulated. The question is who gets to decide how to address it and whether or not Canada has this oversight role that they've established in the GGBPA. Back to you, Eric. That's all I'll say on that matter. If anyone has any questions, let me know. Yeah.
All right. So Robyn, can you flip to the next slide? So before I get into the details of this, I forgot to mention in my when I was talking about the 100% renewable mandates at the state level, similar mandates have been adopted by over 100 municipalities all across the U.S. So that, you know, this is they have stepped into the vacuum left by the federal government as well. So as I mentioned earlier, that the Constitution basically in the US allows the states to regulate, to protect the health and safety of their citizens and environment. But it's limited by the states can't step into the province of the federal government. In the area of foreign affairs, the federal government basically is supposed to speak with one voice on foreign affairs. So this particular lawsuit involves the California-Quebec linkage on the trading of greenhouse gas emissions credits. The Trump administration filed suit last year against California, arguing that this violates 4 specific areas of the federal Constitution that gives the federal government the right to conduct foreign affairs. The suit was dismissed earlier this year. And basically the judge said, no, this is just an agreement between California and Quebec, doesn't rise to the level of a treaty or alliance or confederation, all of which are specific things in international law. And it's not a compact, which is sort of a special congressionally approved agreement between the states. And there are a few of those in the US for, you know, generally used to regulate shared rivers and things like that. But this isn't a compact, it's just sort of a contract between the two sovereigns. Under the foreign affairs doctrine, it said, well, there's no interference with US foreign policy because the US really doesn't have a foreign policy right now with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. The 4th cause of action was punted by the federal government. And I suspect they didn't really have a very strong challenge there. But one implication of the election is that I would be very surprised to see this kind of federal action trying to limit state powers to address greenhouse gases in the absence of a really egregious overstep by one of the states. So next slide, please. So there's a number of other grounds where state actions in this area have been challenged. Probably the most important one is the so-called dormant commerce clause. Under our Constitution, the federal government has the power to regulate interstate commerce. The courts have construed that to prevent the states from enacting discriminatory legislation that gives local economic interests artificial advantage over out-of-state economic interests. A number of renewable portfolio standard state laws have been challenged on this ground. None were successful other than the Minnesota law was successfully challenged on the grounds that it was attempting to regulate commerce where transactions never even entered the state of Minnesota. So that creates an important limitation on state power to address greenhouse gases. You can't regulate transactions that occur entirely outside your state boundaries, even if you want to. That creates complications for the leakage issues that Jen referenced before. The supremacy clause is the second important one. This is primarily played out in the area of federal regulation of electricity markets in the US. Well, we'll probably have a graduate seminar on this particular topic, but the short of it is that the federal government regulates wholesale electricity prices, and there is an ongoing controversy about the extent to which the federal government can use that power to limit the incentives and support that the states give to renewable energy resources on the theory that those subsidies or encouragements artificially distort the wholesale electricity prices. Federal standing and federal court jurisdiction are important considerations right now because there's a number of states and localities that have sued greenhouse gas producers on the theory that greenhouse gas generation has created a nuisance or other common law sort of tort that's affected those states. The US Supreme Court has just taken a case that was filed by the city of Baltimore that will determine whether those cases should be heard in state or federal court. The general view is that the states are a more favorable forum for the states and local jurisdictions. So that's a decision to watch. And I guess the one other note is there was a case brought by a small village in Alaska called Kivalina, arguing on the grounds of federal common law that greenhouse gas production had created a nuisance in the form of erosion of the shoreline, undermining that village. And that suit failed in the Ninth Circuit, US Court of Appeals here, on the ground that there was no standing because the courts couldn't order an effective remedy for this kind of generalized harm that they were talking about. And one other note, depending on federal legislation, the supremacy clause may come into effect again if you get a national carbon price. The extent to which actions like AB 32, which is the California program, interfere with the national carbon pricing regime could become an important question, similar to the question about whether state actions to support renewable energy interfere with the federal role in regulating wholesale electricity prices.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric and Jennifer, for that. I just wanted to note too, if you have any questions, please submit them in the box below and we'll get to them at the end. And if we could just go to the next slide, we'll turn the conversation over to Brook and Liane to talk about private governance. We've talked about climate change regulation. So what can you tell us about the latest developments when it comes to private and corporate governance?
Thanks, Robyn. I think one thing that's important to understand when you talk about corporate action on climate change is that despite the pandemic, climate is still on the corporate agenda. And one of the interesting things is that it's actually potentially sharpening our focus about what do we do about these external threats and how can you prepare for them as a business. And so some people are looking at this as the preliminary round. And if we go to the next slide, there's also kind of a parallel to this is calls for green recovery. So we're in the pandemic right now. We know we need to build back. How are we going to do that? And actually, I might throw it back to you, Robyn, because I know you've had your ear to the ground on this about what's happening in Canada, more specifically about green recovery.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll be quick. I mean, I think there was, when we were leading up to the speech from the throne from the federal government in October, there was a lot of momentum and a lot of discussion about what could be included in that to really align the green recovery with the pandemic recovery. And I mean, we heard some really, really ambitious language that we thought we would hear when it comes to, you know, what more initiatives to surpass their 2030 goals. How can we move towards the net zero goals? How can we focus on the just transition in the Western provinces? But I think a lot of that was taken over by the fact that we started coming back to a second wave of COVID, and there were just, you could not square those two. And so there was still some language within the speech from the throne in terms of next steps, looking to develop and refine the climate change plan and some accompanying legislation this fall. Depending on how long you look at the fall, we haven't seen anything yet, but we have, there is still some strong language out there that I think we'll see unfold, because there are a lot of commitments that were in the Liberal government's or the Liberal Party's election platform just last year in terms of how to move on climate change. So I think they'll come. Maybe we'll see some in the new year, and there's also a fall economic statement that we'll be looking out for as well. But it hasn't got there yet because of COVID.
Yeah, we're not at the recovery stage yet, unfortunately.
Yep.
Just from the U.S. perspective too, you know, this has been talked about quite a bit. I think just to build on something Eric talked about right at the outset, this has kind of fallen flat so far, the idea of a big federal stimulus bill focused on, you know, green infrastructure spending to help boost the economy. But it might occur next year, you know, at least in a limited way. There's precedent for it with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that followed the recession in 2008. I think there is bipartisan interest in increased infrastructure packages. So, you know, that could be one way we see a little bit of this in the US anyhow, but there certainly hasn't been much appetite for it to date at the federal level. Some states and cities are thinking about this with different bond initiatives and different ways to tackle sort of job creation through green infrastructure developments. A lot of it's on the adaptation side, but that's another area. So, you know, as Liane was getting at, despite, you know, whatever may or may not be going on in any given country, in terms of governmental regulation, lots and lots of companies have committed to differing levels of GHG reduction. There's some pretty interesting data out there on the volume of this. As a recent study indicates that almost 25% of major companies, now I don't know how this was defined by this study, but major companies have committed to meaningful GHG reductions by 2030, which is certainly a significant number. This is according to a Fast Company article that was out, I think, last week. And you know, that number is basically quadrupled over the last 4 years. So there's been a lot of growth in this area in terms of private governance and what individual companies are due to develop net zero commitments or even just reduction commitments. It's across lots of different sectors, you know. It's really a broad-based effort. There's some differences within sectors, you know. For example, within the oil and gas industry, some companies have made really aggressive greenhouse gas announcements. And others haven't. So there's been, you know, it's not always even across industries, but it's definitely underway and a trend, and at least in the US. And I think, Liane, similar in Canada?
Yeah, we're seeing similar things in Canada. The government of Canada itself made a commitment to be net zero by 2050. And then we're seeing it also in our major corporations that this is where it's going. And it's including the oil and gas sector. And this is just one of many examples, but Cenovus's long-term ambition is to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And it has some of those interim goals in place, like you're saying, by 2030. Cenovus plans to reduce per barrel greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by the end of 2030, using 2019 as a baseline, and to hold absolute emissions flat by the end of 2030. So we're seeing the same types of kind of goals set out there to reach these net zero commitments.
Yeah, and it's really, it's coming from a number of angles, at least from our perspective. Consumers are demanding it to a certain degree. It's becoming even a competitive thing in certain industries. The outdoor products industry, outdoor recreation, for example, you see a lot of movement towards aggressive standards or even climate neutral type certifications, because skiing, other industries that rely on, snowfall, cold weather, sort of use this as part of their marketing. Other industries, it's more just a general demand from consumers and investors who are focusing on both operational or financial risks related to climate. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the disclosures that go along with that. But and sometimes within, we see action in a lot of the large technology companies in the United States, for example, by sort of activist employees pushing large tech companies to do more internally, even in the absence of a federal or a state requirement to do that. So there's a number of sort of drivers there, and there's some challenges on the other hand. There's a lack of ease in terms of calculating GHG footprints, lots of different standards. The World Resource Institute GHG protocol is really the sort of most robust and probably the most widely accepted, but it's complex. And it takes some work to get your head around that, especially if you're kind of a mid-sized company. It's certainly an issue. And then, there's a lot of difference in terms of how deep the efforts go, or how deep you can measure your footprint or your reduction efforts. It's hard to do that once you get into scope 3 emissions in the supply chain or the value chain for a product. And then, these other questions about reducing direct emissions and contracting for renewable power or carbon offsets to offset what you can't. And so just a number of moving pieces here. I think we're starting to see an industry coalesce around some of this and provide service offerings to help companies. But certainly some work to do. And from an offset market perspective, there's been a lot of growth. I'm seeing, at least in our practice here, a lot more inquiries come in for new carbon offset projects, a lot more transactional volume in the voluntary markets than historically there has been in the U.S., at least just from my limited perspective. And there's a whole bunch of registries out there developing new methodologies, it seems like weekly or monthly, for GHG sequestration, in particular nature-based programs, agriculture, forestry, ocean sequestration. And so, a lot of science happening there and technical work that kind of creates the foundation for these programs, helping drive it. Sourcing and credibility remains key. There were a lot of problems with some of the CDM offsets and RED projects that occurred. And so, they still think there's a little bit of trust issue sometimes, as well as this important consideration to make sure your offset program isn't actually hurting some local group or people in some sort of social harm kind of way. And people are actually looking for offsets, I find, that kind of go beyond, that provide a social good in addition to the environmental benefit. And so all that kind of comes up when you're managing offset project development and procurement. And some of it, relates to the contracts as well, when you're putting those together. Any other thoughts there, Liane?
I always enjoy hearing you talk about the offset programs in the States, just because I think it is a little bit more, it's further along than what's happening in Canada, but that's not to say that nothing is happening. I think it's just that we have been a little bit behind due to the regulatory changes that Jen spoke a little bit about. So just for Ontario, as an example, they had an offset program under the prior cap and trade regime, but when that program was repealed, so too were the offset protocol. That being said, in other provinces, we do have more guidance on offsets. Alberta and BC, for example, have offset programs. And with the federal government, with that Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act that was at the heart of the Supreme Court case that we just argued, there is going to be a recognition of offset credits as part of the second part of that act, the output-based pricing system. So you can use offset credits to meet your requirements. It's just that we're waiting on proposed regulations. They also were to be released in the fall of 2020. Here we are, they're not here yet, but we'll be watching for them. But we do have several government guidance documents that indicate that offsets will be consistent with international ISO standards. So hopefully that will help when we're dealing with kind of cross-border transactions of offsets. That at the end of the day, offsets will be only issued to real, quantified, verified, and unique greenhouse gas emissions. That picks up a little bit on what you said, Brooke, that people who want to make sure that these are actual reductions. And there's hopefully going to be harmonization. The federal government has said that they will accept Alberta and BC's emission offsets under the OBPS. And it will be similar types of projects, anaerobic composting, afforestation projects, landfill methane management. So all of those, we can see that those are going to come online, hopefully, once we get this better guidance. And then I guess this takes us to the last piece of the puzzle when you talk about corporate action on climate change is these disclosure obligations, which are increasingly key to lending and then into other qualifications. And we're seeing the news out of the UK is really interesting to me. So they've said that companies need to report on the financial impacts of climate change in the next 5 years. And it's the first country to make those disclosures mandatory. But at the same time, I think it's not that this doesn't exist in Canada in a certain way already. And that's because securities legislation in Canada always required reporting issuers to disclose the material risks affecting their business and the financial impacts of those risks. But I think what's changed in Canada recently is just a greater understanding of climate change as a material risk. So we saw initially the comments from Mark Carney in 2015, those have just been piled on by many members of the business community. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, coming on board with that. And we're also seeing the regulators kind of supporting these efforts or clarifying how do you do good disclosure and reporting. So last year, the Canadian Securities Administrators issued a specific notice about reporting on climate change related risks. And basically some of the advice was to move beyond your vague disclosures. It's not enough to just say climate change is a risk. You have to start to look at what are the specific litigation, transition, regulatory risks to your business from climate change, and then how are you going to mitigate those risks? And the last thing I'll say is there is also kind of an increased body of knowledge about what does this all mean for boards of directors. And so the Canada Climate Law Initiative, which is a group that Jen and I work with, this summer they commissioned a legal opinion that concluded that corporate board members and officers are legally obligated to address climate change risk and opportunities. And this is all through the corporate duty of care. So you have to be looking, make yourself informed about the risks of climate change, and then be satisfied that something is being done about this material risk. So there is movement on that in Canada, even if it hasn't been made mandatory like in the UK. Is there anything you'd like to add on that, Brooke?
No, I can just say quickly that current SEC requirements in the US don't specifically address climate-related risks, but 2010 SEC guidance requires disclosure for risks that are material. So that's always a question, what's material? And it encompasses, physical risks to infrastructure, supply chain, et cetera, and also transition risks as laws change and that shapes, markets. Voluntary disclosure under TCFD is alive and well, and major investors like BlackRock, I think, and State Street are requiring that for some projects. So I think that's certainly building in the U.S. But yeah, there is not a it's probably not as robust as it is for example in the U.K. And I think there's some questions about what how you define material and kind of how you disclose these risks in a comprehensive and meaningful way. So this is our last slide talking about anyone who's trying to get credit here for this program. And if you are doing so in the United States, you might need a secret password, which is Canada. So write that down and submit it along with your your evaluation form at the email address shown here on the bottom slide, and we'll submit your CLE credits for you. And I don't know how that works in Canada, but I think the Gowling folks have got it under control.
Great. Well, thank you, Liane and Brook, for that. That was, it's really interesting to see how these things are running in parallel, really, and how they're, in some places, you know, there's some type of complementary work, and then others, they're just so different, you know, not even remotely close to what government is doing and just doing what the market is determining. So really interesting parallels there. So I think you've answered everyone's questions as they came up. So well done, panel. We don't have any standing questions and answers, but just since I do have the time, and maybe just see if there's any last minute cue. Oh, as I said, that one comes up. Nope, just thanking us. Great presentation. That's great. So I'll ask one question and see if we have anything come up, but maybe just to each of you quickly, what do you want to see next, given the results that we saw in the US, given what's happening on the private governance side? What's one thing, as one who's invested in this area quite a bit, what's one thing you want to see happen in the short term between the US and Canada? Let's start with, who wants to start? Let's go with Jennifer, because you looked at me.
Did I? This is hard on these Zoom calls. You don't know who you're looking at. You can get in trouble. Well, I think it's really conversations that this is what we're hearing about, that there's going to be more collaboration. I want to hear what it's going to look like. You know, I think not waiting until January. I think we're all very eager to understand how the two countries are going to be working together. So really that, and then I think some action on in the Arctic, I think, is going to be really important going forward. Obviously, the Arctic is the most impacted by climate change, and by all metrics has the least input into it. So anything that the governments can do to work together on that, you know, really shared area of responsibility.
Great.
So
Eric, you can unmute.
Yeah, so I'll take another shot at this. So this is comment probably reflects my particular bias as an energy nerd from the Pacific Northwest, but one of the really important issues for our region that's been percolating along for the last 4 years is the Columbia River Treaty, which currently governs hydroelectric operations on the Columbia River system, which is shared between Canada and the US. This dates back to the early 60s. There's an agreement with the Johnson administration in which basically the river operations, there was an agreed river operations so that the storage reservoirs, which are primarily in Canada, worked in cooperation or in coordination with the energy generation reservoirs, which are primarily in the US, so like Grand Coulee Dam. In return for that, we sent some of the power generation that was enabled by the cooperation back to Canada. I think the treaty, there was a great deal of public involvement about 4 years ago on both sides of the border. And then it kind of went into a black box. We haven't been able to figure out what, if anything, the US State Department has been doing about it. But I anticipate that will at some point bubble up to the surface. And that's, as I said, a really important issue here in the Northwest. I anticipate that the treaty will be expanded to address endangered species, aquatic ecosystems connected with the Columbia River system and so on, rather than just focusing very narrowly on power and water rights.
Great, thank you. Liane, how about you?
I think I'd just pick up on something that I think you said at the beginning, Robyn, that it's what we see here is a tone shift. And I think because climate is a collective action problem, it has been really difficult, at least for this federal government, to implement its priorities when its largest trading partner maybe isn't aligned with that. And so I think what we'll see is those impediments are now going to be reduced. And you'll see, just with corporations kind of leapfrogging what's being done now that they are almost secure in the fact that both sides of the border, there's a recognition that there is a threat of climate change. We can have reasonable discussions and we can about how do we fix it. But at least there's some consensus that there's some movement is needed.
Great, great. And Brooke, what do you think?
Just briefly to build on what Jen said, dialogue, coordination, and a focus on trade. I think Canada's one of the U.S.'s largest trading partners. Mexico is about to launch a carbon scheme. Well, supposedly this year it's going to be delayed, but I think coordinating North American actions in a positive way that helps all the economies is important. You see Europe starting to do that more with a proposed border adjustment mechanism that might come into effect next year. That would place essentially an import carbon tax on products made in higher emitting countries, jurisdictions. So I'm not saying that's the right policy or even a good policy for any particular jurisdiction, but that's an example of coordination by a group that is trying to work together. And I think to the extent there is further action on climate in any of the sort of North American countries, it would be, I think, wise to coordinate that and ensure our mutual trade interests are protected at the same time.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have one question, and I think this will be a good rapid fire, wrap it up kind of question. So we'll keep it to a quick answer from Albert. What do you think is the easiest initiative for both or either country to get done first? Start at the end, Brooke. Quick to start.
I've got two. One thing that could happen pretty quickly in the U.S. is an extension of the renewable energy tax credits that are sunsetting, the investment tax credit and the production tax credit for wind. That's number one. Number two is just improvements in federal permitting processes. There's been some improvement in the past couple of years under the Trump administration in terms of a one federal decision, which has sort of streamlined all the various, or attempted to streamline all the various federal permitting actions, in particular for energy infrastructure projects. And that could be something that could support all forms of energy, including offshore wind, in its build out.
Yeah, and I think that the easiest step, and probably the first one that will be taken by Joe Biden when he's sworn in, is to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And I think you'll also see a large pile of executive orders that will be issued within the first few days of the Biden administration that address climate change and energy policy.
Great. Liane?
I think in terms of what's happening in Canada, the easiest actions will be those related to resiliency, climate adaptation, and investments in infrastructure that can also spur the economy post-COVID. I think that's where we'll see a lot of consensus in Canada.
Great. Last word to Jennifer.
Well, I'll agree with Liane. I think that that's fair. And in Canada, we're in a different situation than Brook and Eric are in, where they're facing a big change. So some of the priorities of our different governments are continuing rather than changing. So we have a better sense of maybe what is difficult or easy for them to manage. I think that right now what we're waiting for is what's the US going to do as our largest trading partner, as Liane mentioned. We want to hear what they're going to do and then see how. I think that the runoff elections in January are going to be really important in the Senate, and then we can see how Canada and the US can cooperate.
Great answers, thank you. So that concludes our session today. I wanted to thank Liane, Eric, Jennifer, Brooke, and your firms, Beveridge, Detterman, and Gowling, and thank you for letting me join in the conversation. I think we're all in agreement that we love talking about this, so it's nice to dedicate a good hour and a half to doing that. So thank you to everyone who joined in, and the comments at the end that appreciated the session, so thank you for those. And with that, I'll wish you a happy afternoon and a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.